We have two highly distinguished speakers this morning, Jennifer Marshall and William Galston. William Galston is the Ezra K. Zucca Chair in Governance Studies and Senior Fellow at the Brookings Institution. He is currently working on several high-profile projects pertaining to core questions of American public philosophy. Before joining Brookings in 2006, Dr. Galston was the Saul Stern Professor and Dean at the School of Public Policy at the University of Maryland. In the 1990s, he served as Deputy Assistant for Domestic Policy to President Clinton, and later as Executive Director for the National Commission on Civic Renewal. His most recent book is Public Matters, Politics, Policy, and Religion in the 21st Century. Jennifer Marshall is Director of Domestic Policy Studies at the Heritage Foundation, overseeing research in education, marriage, family, religion, and civil society. She directs the think tanks Richard and Helen DeVos Center for Religion and Civil Society and manages familyfacts.org, an online catalog of social science research relating to family and religious practice. She has spoken at national and international forums, testified before Congress, and appeared on radio and television shows such as C-SPAN's Washington Journal and Fox News Channel. She is the author of Now and Not Yet, Making Sense of Single Life in the 21st Century. And with that, I will welcome William Galston to the podium.
Thank you. Let me begin with two apologies. Number one, in this period shortly before the presidential election, my schedule is no longer my own, and I will have to leave this panel a little bit early, which I regret. Number two, a slightly more substantive apology. It would be an exaggeration to say that I'm here under false pretenses, but it is certainly the case that there are any number of people in this audience and on this podium who have been much more deeply engaged in this issue of international religious freedom for a much longer time than I have. I guess I'm here in two related capacities. First of all, as a board member of the National Endowment for Democracy, I've had some opportunity to see up close and personally what our capacities are in a related effort overseas and what some of our incapacities are. And secondly, I have been doing a little bit of writing recently on the issue of public diplomacy in general. So what I'd like to do is begin with a general point about public diplomacy and then very briefly answer the four questions that the organizers of this panel have put to me. My general point is that effective policy depends on well-functioning institutions. That doesn't mean that well-functioning institutions guarantee effective policy, but they are its necessary condition. And right now, I don't think that impartial observers would judge that the institutions of public diplomacy in the United States are in good order and well-functioning. In my judgment, the abolition of the U.S. Information Agency and the transfer of some of its functions, not all of them, to the State Department simply has not worked. It has not worked for structural reasons, and if it couldn't be made to work under the leadership of one of President Bush's closest friends, then I don't believe that this structure is capable of being repaired. I think it has to be revised wholesale. In particular, I believe that we need a new, independent, 21st century agency whose sole mission is to think 24 hours a day about U.S. public diplomacy and the way in which it can use its resources and make strategic alliances with other institutions in the federal government in order to push that forward. As long as public diplomacy exists in a subordinate capacity within an agency whose mission is multi-purpose and for whom public diplomacy is traditionally understood is nowhere near the top of the list of its priorities, I don't think that things will go well for public diplomacy in general or for public diplomacy around religious freedom in particular. Now, let me answer the four questions put to me. Number one, It makes sense, I believe, for the United States to include the advancement of religious freedom in its publicly stated foreign policy goals and to take that public declaration seriously. It is important, however, to do this in the right way, and here is my definition of the right way. We should not rest our case on the American example as a model for other nations. I think the rest of the world has had more than enough of that. Instead, we should recur to established international agreements, such as the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. In my judgment, which I no doubt is controversial, this should be part of a broader strategic shift. The United States should behave and present itself less as a self-styled exceptional nation that can make up its own rules, and more as a part of a global system struggling to establish and strengthen norms of domestic and international conduct. Second, advancing religious freedom in the right way means acknowledging that it will not always be policymakers' top priority, and it shouldn't be. We must, and they must, sometimes put other issues, such as nuclear proliferation, first. It is certainly right to give public officials the tools to crack down on nations that repress religious liberty and freedom of expression. It is wrong, in my judgment, to tie their hands by mandating the use of these weapons based on inflexible criteria that do not take the totality of circumstances into account. If you want a slogan, prudence over principles. Here is my answer to the second question. Religious persecution and oppression is a global issue. And we need only think about China in order to see just how global and massive it is. But clearly, there are some distinctive and urgent issues in the Muslim world. And here I can speak based on some experience. In recent years, I've engaged in extensive conversations in various overseas locations with Muslim intellectuals, particularly from the Middle East and North Africa. One of my most startling discoveries, although in retrospect I shouldn't have been surprised, is that they tend to view the United States towards their millennium-long encounter with Europe. And this prism has bred two opposing misunderstandings. First, that the United States is the latest of the Christian crusader nations entering their nation with the objective of entering their region with the intention of crushing Islam. And secondly, that the United States is a godless, militantly secularist regime like revolutionary France and like the many nations, including some in their own region, that the French example inspired. In that context, my stock description, not very innovative, of the United States as religiously vibrant as well as religiously diverse genuinely surprised my Muslim interlocutors, who were tolerably well-informed in many other respects. In this context, and here is my answer to the second question, it would indeed be useful for American public diplomacy to explain our distinctive approach to the rest of the world, not necessarily as an example for other nations to emulate, but as a description of how a large nation has been able to accept, celebrate, and build upon religious diversity, and to link that diversity to the strength of constitutional government. This is an important message about us, and I think that we should be quite forceful, systematic, well-organized in delivering it. My answer to the third question. For reasons rooted in European history, I am not optimistic that public diplomacy alone can do much to convince majority religious communities that religious freedom will promote their interests better than religious monopolies. After all, it took centuries of sometimes bloody religious strife to convince political communities in Europe that a modus vivendi based on religious toleration might be a better approach. The road from toleration, however grudging, to the actual endorsement of religious diversity was longer still. I hope it will not be taken as an affront to my hosts or to our venue to observe that it was not in my lifetime that the Catholic Church accepted religious liberty and diversity as a matter of principle rather than as a disagreeable necessity to be put aside as soon and if circumstances warranted. And so, I say somewhat pessimistically, if the Shia majority government that seems likely to persist in Iraq long after we leave is not convinced that decent treatment of religious minority religions will better serve its interests than would discrimination or suppression, I fear it will take more violence and death over an extended period to drive the message home that tolerance as a modus vivendi is a better course. This is not an argument for us to stop making our case, but we should be realistic about the prospects for its early success. Finally, I want to draw a distinction, which may prove controversial, between religious liberty and unfettered freedom of action for foreign missionaries. And this is my answer to the fourth and final question put to me. I am not now, nor have I ever been, a student of international law. Having said this, an amateur common sense reading of Article 18 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights does not suggest that religious freedom implies the unfettered right of foreign missionaries to cross international borders for proselytizing purposes. In addition, prudence suggests that we not sacrifice religious freedom as a whole on the altar of what is its most controversial aspect in many other nations. As Jose Casanova points out, indeed in one of the publications of this project, the uninformed enthusiasm of American missionaries has often backfired, driving indigenous religious forces, including many Orthodox churches, into tighter alliances with repressive regimes. We will do the cause of religious freedom no good if we identify it with the willingness of majority non-Christian nations, many of them scarred by the experience of colonialism, to admit missionaries. Instead, we should focus on promoting liberty for indigenous religious minorities that already exist. The fact that every human being is guaranteed the right to change his religion, and what could be more fundamental than that, does not imply that the citizens of other countries enjoy an equally fundamental right to persuade him to do so. I am well aware that this stance will not endear me to those evangelicals who view proselytizing activities as one of the central features of their faith. I can only hope, I say in conclusion, that their support for international religious freedom rests on a broader foundation. Thank you.
Well, it's a delight to be here for this very interesting and I think important conference, and a real honor to share this platform with Bill Galston, for whom I have a lot of respect for his intellect and breadth of interests, and I also share his sense of humility and respect for you as an audience. Since the end of the Cold War, public diplomacy has been in a bit of turmoil. There was talk of the end of history and the closing of the U.S. Information Agency. There was a sense that the ideological struggle that had dominated the Cold War and the global stage had largely ceased, or at least sunk well into the background. The whiplash of 9/11, of course, yanked our attention back to ideological warfare, and we should keep it there. The United States should expect to be endlessly engaged in cold wars of ideas. America is a nation built on an idea, specifically that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. That idea had its enemies in 1776, and it continues to have them today. Well, in a war of ideas, your ideas had better be in good fighting shape. I'm paraphrasing the late Ada Bozeman. Today, a number of ideas central to the American order are not in prime fighting shape, and that includes ideas about the importance of religious liberty and practice in American society. U.S. public diplomacy aims to impart to foreign audiences an understanding and appreciation of American ideals, principles, institutions, and policy. That means it must be firmly grounded in those principles and ideals. But this isn't just the task of public diplomacy. It's also the basic prerequisite of self-government itself. Democratic government demands a high degree of social self-consciousness when it comes to the ideas that sustain the order. The principles and institutions of a free society are inherently more susceptible to corruption of purpose and meaning than are those of a more authoritarian state. But despite this, despite this imperative of self-government, Americans have not been consistently diligent in defending the ideas at the heart of the American order. Our disinclination to study our own history and founding principles, let alone the history of foreign cultures and thought, has left us with an unconvincing national self-image, in the words of Bozeman. A vague, unconvincing national identity makes it difficult to put together a coherent public diplomacy strategy. And that leaves America's defining attributes exposed to mischaracterization at home and abroad. Well, I want to start here by making 3 observations about religion in America, and then move to 4 suggestions for what that might mean for public diplomacy. My first observation is that the American model of religious liberty and its thriving religious culture are significant defining attributes of the United States. These features characterize the American order as much as our democratic political system or our market economy. Religion has been a dominant theme from the earliest settlements to the great social justice causes of the 19th and 20th centuries. And today, almost 90% of Americans say religion is at least somewhat important in their lives. About 6 in 10 are members of a local religious congregation. And faith-based organizations are extremely active in providing for social needs at home, as well as sending aid abroad. My second observation is that religious liberty is an American success story, and we should be telling that story around the world. The American constitutional order produced a constructive tension between religion and state. One of the major reasons for the success of the American experiment is that it helped to balance citizens' dual allegiances to God and to earthly authorities without forcing believers to abandon or to moderate their primary loyalty to God. That habit of reconciling civil and religious authorities, as well as the process of harmonizing the interests of competing religious groups, helped to fortify the discipline of self-government. Meanwhile, the moral authority exercised by religious congregations, family, and other private associations helps to maintain limited government. The founders frequently stressed that virtue and religion are essential to maintaining a free society because they preserve, as Tom West has put it, the moral conditions of freedom. My final observation. Today, the religious roots of the American order and the role of religion in its continued success are poorly understood. The constructive tension I described is painted by some as radical separation. Well, that's more French than American, and I'm saying that as one of the few conservative Francophiles in town. The American Revolution had a much different character than that of the French Revolution, and French laïcité creates quite a different climate than we have known in America. And yet, we're seeing more tendency to drift toward that continental climate in recent decades. One source of that drift is the notion of strict separation of church and state, which suggests that the government should have nothing to do with religion. This encourages the view that religion is a personal, private affair, irrelevant to public policy. Another source is the assumption that political and social progress will increasingly marginalize religion. Well, data on religious belief and practice in the U.S. and around the world, however, defy that theory. The lack of understanding of the continued relevance of religion in America's constitutional order prevents clear thinking about the relationship between religion and liberty. It also creates blinders to religion's influence abroad. If policymakers are unfamiliar with a religious framework for interpreting human action and motivation, they will be ill-equipped to imagine how to communicate effectively with highly religious audiences. Religion defines the worldview of many whom U.S. policy seeks to influence. So as our foreign policy seeks to win hearts and minds, to advance freedom, and to promote stability, it must systematically engage religious ideas and audiences. At present, this engagement is isolated and inconsistent. So what practical steps could we take to get more attention to religion and religious freedom in U.S. public diplomacy? Let me offer 4 ideas. I'll list them and then explain them. First, muster the full force of America's founding ideals. Second, merge the freedom agendas. 3, enlist mediators of the message. And 4, map out common ground. So mustering the full force of America's founding ideals. Public diplomacy leadership calls for more than communications and marketing credentials. The message itself is even more critical than the modes and techniques for projecting it to the world, as important as those are. In the 21st century war of ideas, it is absolutely critical that U.S. public diplomacy rely on the bedrock of American founding principles. Pop culture and commercialism do not do justice to American ideals. They are flimsy and inadequate in the fight against potent ideologies that present strong and coherent, as well as deeply misguided, explanations of the nature and purpose of human existence. This calls for stronger stuff than Coca-Cola and Britney Spears. U.S. policymakers must understand and be able to articulate the role of religion in the American constitutional order, and foreign service training should promote that end. Tom Farr and I have just been co-authoring a chapter for a forthcoming book, and he brings the suggestion that we should be creating a subspecialty career track in FSO training and career advancement possibilities that would allow for specialization in religious liberty. Second, we need to merge the freedom agendas more clearly. The International Freedom Agenda should better integrate the ongoing work to promote religious liberty. After all, it is the first freedom. In a recent article on the 10th anniversary of the International Religious Freedom Act, Nina Shea related the story of a senior State Department official working on Iraq policy who didn't know that there was a State Department office on religious freedom. The office and the ambassador at large need to be more visible and integrated into the overall policy-making functions of the department. In the case of public diplomacy, assigning personnel in regional bureaus at the State Department has helped integrate public diplomacy, within mainstream diplomatic concerns. That may not be the solution here, but there should be similar mechanisms for evaluating religious dynamics of target cultures, and those should become a regular function of analysis, and articulating the role of religion in the U.S. should be a consistent feature of our communications strategy. And the vision of religious liberty must be robust. Condemning and curtailing religious persecution is a critical goal, but a more expansive agenda should seek to promote political conditions that consistently apply religious liberty tenets rooted in constitutional government. This calls for a wider view of the mandate of religious liberty at the State Department within and the office itself. With its annual reports, the office serves as an important human rights monitor, but the foreign policy engagement on religious liberty should go further. The office should serve as a resource and offer strategic input in the essential task of establishing freedom of religion as the foundation of democracy. Third, we need to enlist mediators of the message. Public diplomacy should broaden dialogue between American citizens, American institutions, and their counterparts abroad. That includes religious individuals and groups. Engaging religious audiences to help develop the habits of a free and civil society is essential to promoting liberty in much of the world. Religious groups in the U.S. may be able to help further the work of public diplomacy by reaching religious groups abroad in ways that the U.S. government cannot. So one idea would be to seek the counsel of religious individuals and groups with experience in target cultures. This would include military chaplains who have been assigned to regions of the world and who can provide, where religion is a major motivating factor, who can provide insight and assistance in communicating with religious audiences. And Christian missionaries serving foreign communities through schools, hospitals, and other mercy ministries are one example of highly harmonious interaction between the United States and non-Western cultures. I think for as many examples of naivete, we have examples of expertise being developed as well, and that could make a significant contribution to our foreign policy insight. One example I'll offer is the Classical School of the Medes. in the Kurdish area of northern Iraq. The school was launched in January 2001 by American evangelicals to provide English language education with a classical curriculum. The school had expanded by popular demand to 3 campuses by the time of Saddam Hussein's fall. Today, those 3 campuses are serving about 1,000 students, about 95% of whom are Kurdish Muslims. When Reconstruction began in Iraq the summer and fall of 2003, there was demand for the school to expand even further. So what better than a school teaching the classics to help cultivate civil society? Now, I don't offer that as something that the State Department should adopt, but those are the kinds of experiences that would be useful for illuminating our education, the education piece of Iraqi Reconstruction. There should also be encouragement in building upon faith-based diplomacy. This is a type of Track 2 diplomacy conducted by non-officials. It combines insights from religious faith with the practice of international relations. Pope John Paul II might be the preeminent example of a faith-based diplomat, but many other religious believers would also qualify, a number of you in this room. This sort of unofficial diplomat has moral authority and engages in conflict resolution by appealing to transcendent spiritual resources, including sacred texts and prayer. For example, Doug Johnston's International Center for Religion and Diplomacy is helping reform Pakistani madrasas. David Blankenhorn's Institute for American Values is sponsoring an Islam West series of conversations between scholars and religious figures from both parts of the world. And we heard earlier about the Institute for Global Engagement's work in the Northwest Frontier province of Pakistan. And my final suggestion is that we map out common ground more clearly. U.S. public diplomacy must convey to majority religious communities that religious freedom will continue to promote a positive and public role for religion. The American model of religious liberty takes a favorable view of religious practice, both in private and public. Far from privatizing or marginalizing religion, it assumes an active role for religious believers and institutions in society, including engagement in the political process and the formulation of public moral consensus. Religious believers seeking a peaceful, strong, stable community can find considerable common ground in their views of human life, family, and ordering society with respect to the transcendent. They share concern about radical secularism that would marginalize religious practice from public life. At the United Nations, for example, NGOs representing Catholic, evangelical, Mormon, and Muslim perspectives have worked together to advance policies related to the life of the unborn child, family, and civil society. This kind of goodwill interaction provides a starting point for expanding a vision of religious liberty in the interest of religious faith and values. So in closing, U.S. public diplomacy should communicate the continued importance of religion and traditional values in American life. Most Americans continue to attach great significance to religious faith and practice, marriage, family, and raising children in a morally supportive environment, values shared in many highly religious societies around the world. Thank you.
Thank you both. I think we'll start by giving you each a chance to respond to the other's presentation, and then we'll open it up for questions.
I think, although we did not coordinate our remarks, you heard a lot more common ground than disagreement. And of many points that I agree with, I would just pull out the idea that the rest of the world needs to understand the way we do our religious business here in the United States a whole lot better than it does. It may be in part, oh my God, I'm sorry.
Next appointment.
It may be in part a function of our own confusion or lack of clarity, but I think we have done an extremely poor job of explaining the U.S. religious constitutional settlement and its fruits to the rest of the world. And if I were to identify the top priority for international religious public diplomacy, it would be to engage in that process of explanation seriously. And we do not have to say, after we convey who we are, we do not have to go on to say, you should be more like us. You know, if people are attracted by our example, they will reach that conclusion on their own. And if they're not, telling them that they should be more like us is not going to get us very far.
I agree. I think we had many points of commonality there, and significantly, it's interesting that I think we both spend most of our time in domestic policy, but there are so many aspects of this civil society discussion domestically that need to be connected with the foreign policy discussion. The character of our culture is going to very much define our ability to lead in the world. So I think we need to think very strategically, and there have been discussions. The civil society discourse domestically in the last 20 years, I would say, has yielded a lot of good practical format for how that might happen on a foreign policy stage as well. So I'm hopeful that we'll have more interchange between domestic and foreign folks who are experts. I might just slightly amend what your suggestion of prudence over principles to suggest that maybe our best course is to take principles and mediate them by prudence.
Of course.
Okay.
I'm glad we're all agreed here. Okay, let's open it up for questions, and please bear in mind that Dr. Galston is only able to be here with us another about 10 minutes, so keep your questions brief as you can. Thanks. We have a gentleman.
Hi, my name is Abbas Jaffer from the Buxton Initiative. My question is related to Ms. Marshall's comments about the constructive tension in the U.S. between faith and civil society. And I guess the question I would have earlier was brought up about having people looking at the religious dimension as part of the Foreign Service. My question is, though, especially for government employees and the whole psychology of that, you know, when you enter government service, you swear an oath to the Constitution above all else. And so I can see how that might be a problem for people, like you said, for whom God is their primary loyalty, for example. And my question would be, how do you resolve that tension within government bureaucracy and thereby encourage people with a religious prism to become more involved in this important diplomacy that needs to happen?
Well, I think we have more than 2 centuries of experience going to the answer of that. The founders wrestled quite a bit with that. They in no way saw civil service as incompatible with faith in God. They might have seen the contrary is more true. I think that we have quite a bit of wealth of material that we need to unearth to make clear that faith in God is a welcome asset to bring to civil service. The understanding of a moral order and a public consensus about that moral order that draws on arguments that have their antecedents in religious truth. That is acceptable in our American public discourse. And it is acceptable even within bureaucracy. So I think we need to clarify our understanding of that quite a bit, I think.
I totally agree with that, and I'd add just one word, and that is that there are some theologians who probably couldn't enter into that kind of public service in good faith. The name, for example, of Stanley Hauerwas comes to mind immediately. I mean, there are certain people with certain understandings of the relationship between, the two sides of Caesar's famous coin, who probably ought to consider themselves as debarred from public service because they could not take the constitutional oath in good conscience.
Faith McDonald from the Institute on Religion and Democracy. Thank you both so much. Dr. Galston, this is mostly for you. When you talked about focus on supporting indigenous religious people rather than proselytization by foreign missionaries, a lot of what we see, the persecution of people going on, is indigenous people of a minority faith who are proselytizing, not in a forceful way, but just by the winsomeness of their own testimony. And part of the problem is that the perception of the faith says that this is a Western imposition, but in many cases it goes back very, very far. So I just wondered if you would make an exception in those cases.
Oh, I tried to be quite clear in distinguishing between our religious export policies on the one hand, and what's going on in the domestic religious economies of those countries. And, and clearly within those countries, the activities that you're talking about are part of religious liberty. So I was careful to say that, it's not my position that proselytizing activities, insofar as they're part of the core religious expression of particular faiths, which is not true of all faiths, by the way, should not fall under the aegis of the protection of the principle of religious liberty in general. Of course they should. I was adverting only to some of the things that happened in the first wave of enthusiasm after the fall of certain sorts of barriers in the past 20 years, and the negative consequences that our religious exports had for religious liberty itself in some of those countries. And so it was both a principled and prudential warning against putting too much emphasis on that, but I agree with your point.
I'm Jordan Pendergrass, a student here at Georgetown, and I'm a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, which has been mentioned. Thank you. Who is to say, and how do we know when there has been a level of international religious liberty established in a country? Thank you.
This is definitely a spectrum, and that's where I would say that our experience over the centuries is a useful one and rooted in a heritage beyond that. So there are going to be development, and we shouldn't think that once crossed a certain finish line of desirable, ideal religious liberty that it will always stay there. This has to be cultivated and nurtured. So I guess I would see it as a much more dynamic process than might be suggested by your question.
That's a good question. I don't think there's any single answer. I imagine lots of criteria for the existence and exercise of religious liberty would be common ground among the members of this audience. I don't think it's not very difficult to come up with a basic template of sort of particular liberties, the absence of which would lead a reasonable observer to say that it does not exist or does not exist fully in a particular country. My understanding, for example, is that various reports that are now made public, including the State Department's annual report, do exactly that. And I think that report tries very hard to come up with the sorts of criteria that would command broad assent among those people who believe in the concept of religious liberty, but may have somewhat different conceptions of how it's to be fleshed out in practice.
Question in the back.
Good morning. My name is Tom Carter. I'm with the Beckett Fund for Religious Liberty. I would like to know some specific recommendations for the next administration, whether it's McCain or Obama, some specific things, maybe the one or two things you would like to see happen. We're in the middle of a campaign right now. They're making all kinds of promises, whether it's Obama buying up McCain says we should buy up these various mortgages, or Obama wants to double the size of the Peace Corps. What specifically would you like to see these guys talk about and maybe promise the American people in the next administration? And actually, I'd like to see all the panelists before and after answer this exact same question. You've made some general comments regarding revamping public diplomacy agency. Ms. Marshall, you said increase foreign service training and the subspecialty in religious liberty. Is that your number one thing that you would like either an Obama administration or a McCain administration to do?
I think maybe the most important would be to take very seriously appointments to public diplomacy leadership.
Mm-hmm. And I will give you my answer, which will also have to be my swan song, I'm afraid. And that is that, as I said at the beginning of my remarks, good institutions don't guarantee good and effective policies, but they are its necessary condition. And I hope it's not just because I'm sitting in the governance studies program at the Brookings Institution that I would answer your question by saying that I think we need a 21st century version of the 20th century institution that we unwisely abolished as part of a political deal in the 1990s. If the U.S. Information Agency had survived until 9/11, it would never have been abolished. Indeed, instead it would have been expanded and given a new mandate consistent with the new ideological struggle in which we're now embroiled. And I believe that I have no influence on either political campaign and no reason to believe that either one is listening to me. But if either one were, I would say, in the same way that FEMA can't work as a part of the Department of Homeland Security and shouldn't be in it, so public diplomacy cannot work as an obscure corner office of the State Department and ought to be removed from it. So is that specific enough?
That's pretty specific, but I would like to actually follow up. And you sort of answered this, Ms. Marshall, maybe you can answer as well. Do you have any hope or idea that your ideas are more than pie in the sky, that you can get this stuff on these guys' radar?
I note with interest that there's a rising tide of congressional activity on a bipartisan basis around this particular suggestion. And a pretty good way to get a president's attention is to have a fair number of sponsors and co-sponsors of a bill that has a lot of support within civil society as well. So there are lots of different ways of getting a president's attention.
And I don't know that it ranks at the presidential level, but this conference series is a definite contribution towards getting it more on the public radar screen.
Okay, any further questions for Jennifer? We have a few more minutes. I see a hand over the corner. Yes. It's coming. The mic's coming around.
Mic's coming. I'm Joni Feingold, a PhD student at George Mason University. My question for you is, post Johnson and Sampson's book of, religion, the missing dimension of foreign policy, in the last year or two, can you talk about what you've seen in the State Department as far as any improvement in the use or the awareness of religion or openness of religion, et cetera? Has there been any improvement?
I'm not sure that I can answer to your specific time frame, but I think it's encouraging the accumulation of these things. You had Doug Johnston's earlier compilation, I forget what year that was, but early 2000s. There was another compilation, several volumes from the early 2000s, the establishment of the office just before that of religious freedom, more discussion seriously now, I think, in the last 3 to 5 years about public diplomacy itself. So let's harmonizing these two things. I think there's cranking up attention on both policy issues, and now for the concentration of this particular panel, I think maybe the interchange between those two conversations is going to be important. So really, thank you guys for putting this topic on the agenda today, and I hope there will be many subsequent conversations about that.
Okay. Other questions?
I'm Deborah Allen. I teach at Concordia University in Austin, Texas, and I'm a historian. And this is somewhat pessimistic, but I think before we focus on public diplomacy abroad about the U.S. Constitution and the First Amendment, we need to do a really good job about educating Americans about the Constitution and the First Amendment and religious freedom, what it means.
I fully agree with you. I couldn't agree with you more. And I think I enjoy working at an institution where we handle these as a cluster of issues. And increasingly, as I mentioned, I think we need to make more interchange between our domestic and foreign policy discussions. But education is the critical piece. And unless we are inculcating an understanding of the Constitution itself, particularly the religious liberty aspects of it, we're going to have a tough time. These are big debates in public education, and the sort of climate of intimidation that has sometimes existed in public education toward religion doesn't help to teach what the true nature of American religious liberty is all about. So there are policies in education and across civil society all the way to foreign policy that matter here and have to do with the subject at hand.
Question up front.
Just one fast question about what is your review about the limits for religious freedom? Just to make it clear, if I have a religion now that promotes killing young children as part of my practice, will you allow this under the banner of religious freedom, or will you stop me from doing it? So I would like just to get an answer.
Could you quickly identify yourself?
My name is Tawfiq Hamid. I am a Muslim. I'm a former member of a terrorist Islamic organization called Jama'ah Islamiyah. I was with Dr. Ayman al-Zawahri, who became second commander of Al-Qaeda. Currently, I am a reformer of Islam, providing a new interpretation, peaceful interpretation for the religion. Yeah.
Well, this has been a very important question that U.S. courts have had to deal with and have clearly defined that there are some claims made under a religious guise that are not permissible. And this is where that reconciliation of dual authorities is so critical, the understanding of what is acceptable in a civil society. There are limits between an exchange, a reconciliation between the laws of a civil society and the claims of a religious individual. And it's that exchange that allows us to have a wide range of freedom, but also limits to those freedoms as well, rights and responsibilities both.
Question in the back.
Hi, my name is Sebastian Summers. I'm an international relations student from the University of Kent in England. How can you specifically can you explain how you can encourage the domestic religious organizations to how do you explain that the negative aspects of exporting religion to countries that don't necessarily want it? I'm referring in specific to Mr. Galston's comments on the subject. How do you politically get that across in a nation where there's a very strong lobby towards Christian ideals of spreading the message, so to say?
Let me start answering that and make sure I've got the drift of your question. We in America believe in a free currency of ideas and a freedom of conscience, and that includes the freedom of religious individuals to promulgate their ideas at home or abroad to the extent that they personally are able to get traction or that their group is able to get traction. They have that freedom of movement, we believe, the world over. Now, other countries may pose limits on that, and that is the business of other countries. But as the United States seeks religious liberty abroad, it seeks it, and I would agree with Bill Galston here, on behalf of that society's citizens, on behalf of that society's members. And so creating the climate is first and foremost for that nation. That will have a side benefit of benefiting those from our society who may move into that space. So I guess there's a freedom of movement in ideas that the American government shouldn't try to curb with regard to religious believers.
I was more referring to explaining the danger. Sorry, I was more referring to explaining the dangers, as and Dr. Galston was referring to, of exporting particular ideas in a particular way, namely the missionaries that go abroad, and the negative side effects that has, and in the perception of the United States when people do those things.
Well, I think there are also many examples of a wealth of good cultural exchange that comes through those that movement of people in missionary circles. So we might have a disagreement on the premise there.
Okay, we have time for one more. Gentleman on the left.
I'm David Little from Harvard University. Bill Galston, in his comments, did emphasize that we should tell the American religious liberty story, but he also emphasized as his second point that we should do this in the right way, which means that we should integrate our experience into a broader set of international agreements, human rights agreements, and that we should spend a good deal of our time emphasizing our commitment to international human rights arrangements. It seemed to me, Ms. Marshall, in your comments, you didn't really address the relation between our own story and the international system, and I wonder if you would comment on that. And do you see both points of convergence and some tensions between the U.S. experience and the international system, Article 18, et cetera? Thank you.
Yeah, I thank you for the question, and I took our assignment for today to be speaking to the issue of public diplomacy, which is first and foremost about telling the American story. And so I think we have to get that right. And what limited capacity we have on public diplomacy, dollars and resources and human resources, I think we should dwell quite a bit on that. Now, some of that is going to be looking for the harmony that can be found in the Universal Declaration and things like that. But we're dwelling mostly here on the story of the United States, and it's a good one in this regard. We have had our growing pains, and we continue, and we always will, to maintain religious liberty. But I think first and foremost, that's where the concentration should be within public diplomacy. That's not to exclude other things that will go on in other places of the State Department and so on, but that was the emphasis that I wanted to make.
Okay, well, we are out of time. We are going to take a 15-minute break now and then resume promptly at 11:15. But join me in thanking Jennifer and Bill Galston in absentia.